In the shadow of the towering Alps, smoke curled above razed villages, and terrified whispers carried the name of a migrating horde, the Helvetii. 360,000 souls, warriors, women, and children, marched like a living storm, leaving only ash in their wake. Rome's northern frontier crumbled. Governors fled in disgrace. Yet from this chaos, one man saw destiny written in fire and blood. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and the fate of Gaul and the Republic itself would be decided on those frozen battlefields. Witness the clash that forged an empire's legend, where ambition met destiny and rivers of blood carved the path of Rome's rise. Stay with us as we unravel this forgotten war, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the march through history. The year was 58 BC, and the icy winds of the Alps carried whispers of doom. Northern Gaul, once a buffer of loyal tribes and Roman allies, was now a smoldering wasteland. Villages lay in ruins, their charred timbers jutting up like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Screams and war cries echoed through forests thick with mist, and columns of refugees staggered southward, desperate to escape the storm that was the Helvetii migration. They came not as raiders, but as a nation on the move. More than 360,000 souls, warriors, elders, women, and children, flowed like a human tide, an unstoppable force consuming everything in its path. Their warriors, clad in furs and iron, wielded spears that glittered in the sunlight like a field of stars. Behind them trudged great wagons laden with supplies and livestock. A mobile kingdom uprooted from the harsh valleys of modern-day Switzerland. For them, this was a desperate quest for survival. For Rome, it was an existential threat. In the border provinces of Gaul, chaos reigned. Local governors, unprepared for such a mass exodus, scrambled to muster defenses. Yet the Helvetii advanced with terrifying speed, burning their own villages to ensure there would be no retreat. Roman allies sent frantic messengers southward, begging for legions, pleading for protection. Their pleas were often met with silence or empty promises, for Rome was distracted by political rivalries, corruption, and complacency. The Helvetii descended upon settlements like a thunderstorm. Ancient fortresses that had stood for generations were abandoned in panic. The once secure frontier crumbled, its watchtowers overrun. Merchants fled, and trade routes that had enriched Rome for centuries were severed overnight. Grain prices soared, fear spread like wildfire, and rumors of barbarian hordes sweeping south toward Italy began to haunt the Senate chambers in the capital. The Alps themselves became a silent accomplice to the invading mass. Narrow passes, steep cliffs, and deep roaring rivers all favored the Helvetii, who moved like wolves through terrain that rendered Roman legions slow and vulnerable. Scouts returned to Roman outposts with grim reports. This was no mere raid. The Helvetii sought a new homeland, and they would take it by fire and sword. Rome's defenses in the north were pitifully thin. Decades of political neglect had left Gaul a fractured mosaic of tribes, some loyal to Rome, others resentful of its dominance. Roman commanders, many of them inexperienced politicians granted military power, were overwhelmed by the scale of the threat. Entire garrisons abandoned their posts, retreating in disgrace rather than face annihilation. For the Roman Republic, this was more than a military crisis. It was a spiritual and political one. Rome prided itself on being the master of the known world, the conqueror of Carthage, the unifier of Italy. Yet now, in the shadow of the Alps, that pride was cracking. Senators bickered in marble halls while the northern frontier burned. The Republic had grown complacent, and its enemies sensed weakness. The Helveti's migration was like a prophecy of collapse, a vision of Rome brought low by an enemy not of cities or kings, but of a determined people with nothing left to lose. Their sheer numbers alone threatened to overwhelm even the most disciplined legions. Gaul's once thriving countryside became a sea of smoke and ruin, a warning of what awaited Italy should the barbarians break through. This was the setting in which destiny would summon one man. But at this moment, in the bitter winter of 58 BC, Rome was leaderless in its fear, teetering on the edge of chaos. The Eternal City's legions were scattered, its governors disgraced, and its enemies emboldened. The Alps stood not as a wall of protection, but as a chilling reminder that even the greatest empire could falter. And above the din of fleeing refugees and burning villages, one message echoed like a funeral bell. The Helvetii are coming. In the midst of chaos, when Rome's pride trembled and her frontiers bled, a single name began to stir whispers across the provinces: Gaius Julius Caesar. At this point in history, he was not yet the dictator immortalized in marble statues, or the man who would reshape the destiny of an empire. He was a newly appointed governor, given command over Gaul's legions more out of political convenience than trust. To many senators in Rome, Caesar was an ambitious politician. Brilliant, yes, but dangerous. Yet destiny rarely announces itself with titles. It reveals itself in the fire of crisis. Caesar arrived in Gaul not as a savior, but as a man burdened with suspicion. The Senate had granted him command of a modest force, several legions that had grown lax from years of peace. Their discipline had softened. Their morale was low. Many soldiers doubted their new commander, whispering of his debts, his scandals, his enemies in Rome who waited for his failure. But Caesar carried himself with a confidence that cut through skepticism like a blade. He was a man who saw opportunity where others saw ruin. The Helvetii migration was not just a threat, it was a stage, a proving ground. Caesar understood this better than anyone. If he could turn back the tide of 360,000 determined warriors, his name would thunder through the Senate halls of Rome. Victory here would cement his reputation, elevate his political standing, and silence those who mocked him as a demagogue. The stakes were monumental, and Caesar, with his keen intellect and ruthless ambition, embraced them. He began by forging his army anew. In makeshift camps along the cold rivers of Gaul, he drilled his legions relentlessly. Day and night, soldiers marched, dug trenches, built fortifications, and practiced maneuvers until exhaustion became routine. He enforced discipline with an iron hand, punishing cowardice and rewarding valor. Caesar knew that the Helvetii would not be defeated by numbers alone. Rome's advantage lay in its unmatched organization, its iron discipline, and its ability to turn chaos into order. But Caesar was more than a tactician. He was a master of morale. He spoke to his men not as a distant patrician, but as a comrade. He dined with them, praised their courage, and painted vivid visions of glory. Around campfires, soldiers listened as Caesar's words crackled like sparks. "This land is Rome's. These forests, these rivers, they are ours to defend. If the Helvetii wish to test our steel, we shall write their doom into the soil they covet." His speeches ignited something within the men, a loyalty that would follow him across every battlefield for the rest of his life. While other commanders hesitated, Caesar moved swiftly. He gathered intelligence, sending scouts deep into Helvetii-held territory. He studied their movements, their supply lines, and their strategies. What others saw as an unstoppable migration, he analyzed as a logistical challenge. The Helvetii's sheer size was both their strength and their weakness. They could not move quickly, nor could they easily conceal themselves. Caesar began plotting not just a battle, but a campaign, a chess match played on the rugged board of Gaul. Yet Caesar's rise was not without danger. In Rome, enemies sharpened daggers in the Senate. They feared his growing power and influence, whispering that this ambitious governor might use his victories to challenge the Republic itself. Caesar understood this perfectly. To him, success in Gaul was not merely a military objective. It was survival. Failure would mean disgrace, exile, or worse. The stakes of every decision were measured in both blood and politics. In these moments of uncertainty, Caesar's genius shone brightest. He combined political cunning with military audacity, securing alliances with some Gallic tribes while intimidating others into submission. Through diplomacy and fear, he began to weave a web of influence that stretched across the fractured land of Gaul. The Helvetii might have been the immediate enemy, but Caesar's true vision extended far beyond them. He saw Gaul not as a border to be defended, but as a jewel to be claimed. The transformation of his army was nothing short of miraculous. Ragged soldiers became hardened warriors, their confidence growing with each skirmish and drill. Roman engineers, famed for their ingenuity, constructed fortifications at breathtaking speed, erecting walls, ditches, and bridges in record time. Caesar pushed them to their limits, often laboring alongside his men to set an example. He was relentless, but his soldiers came to respect him deeply. They began to see him not as a distant patrician, but as a leader forged by the same hardships they endured. As winter thawed into spring, the Helveti's advance showed no sign of slowing. They poured across rivers and forests, leaving destruction in their wake. Refugees flooded Roman-controlled territory, bringing tales of atrocities and fear. Yet Caesar's legions no longer trembled. They were ready. The governor, who had arrived in Gaul as a political outcast, now stood as a general with an army reborn. There was something almost prophetic in Caesar's rise. In the campfires that flickered along the frontier, men whispered that their commander was destined for greatness, that the gods themselves had chosen him to lead Rome into a new era. Caesar did nothing to dispel these rumors. He cultivated them. For him, war was not just survival. It was theater, a performance for both his men and his enemies. And so, as the Helvetii marched closer, Caesar prepared not merely for battle, but for legend. The Alps loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks casting shadows over the blood-soaked valleys below. Rome's frontier was no longer a place of fear, but a crucible where Caesar would test his destiny. With every soldier he trained, every fortification he raised, and every speech he gave, the die was cast. The man who had once been dismissed as a bankrupt politician was about to become something far more dangerous, a commander whose ambition could shake the very foundations of the Republic. The Helvetii had unleashed a storm upon Gaul, but in their wake they had awakened a greater one, a man who would stop at nothing to carve his name into eternity. Far from the bloodied frontier, beneath the marble columns of the Senate, Rome itself quivered, not from swords or fire, but from whispers. The eternal city, seat of 1,000 victories, was rotting beneath the weight of its own ambition. Senators in pristine togas argued endlessly, their voices echoing through chambers where decisions that shaped empires were once made with iron will. Now the Republic was a theater of intrigue, a nest of serpents where power was traded like coin and loyalty was an illusion. The reports from Gaul had sent ripples of fear through Rome's patrician class. Entire provinces lay in ruins, and trade caravans that once carried wine, grain, and gold were replaced by streams of terrified refugees. Prices soared. The bustling markets of the Forum buzzed with rumors of barbarian hordes, of slaughtered Roman allies, of villages razed to ash. For the citizens of Rome, the Helvetii migration was not a distant affair. It was a shadow creeping closer, a reminder that their empire's borders were fragile. Yet within the Senate, unity was nowhere to be found. Caesar's rise unsettled the delicate balance of Roman politics. His enemies, conservative senators of the Optimates faction, viewed him as a dangerous upstart. They had not forgotten his debts, his populist reforms, and his alliance with Crassus and Pompey, the so-called First Triumvirate. To them, Caesar's command in Gaul was not a service to the Republic, but a stepping stone to tyranny. They watched him closely, waiting for failure, praying that the Helvetii would humble him. Even those who supported Caesar did so out of self-interest, calculating their political survival like generals planning a siege. Rome's stability was an illusion. Beneath the grandeur of its temples and aqueducts lay festering rivalries, class tensions, and corruption. Senators debated endlessly about sending reinforcements to Gaul, but most preferred to hold their legions close, guarding their own power rather than aiding Caesar's campaign. In this toxic climate, Caesar found himself isolated. His victories would be celebrated by the people but feared by the Senate. His failures would be seized upon as proof of incompetence. The Helvetii were a threat to Rome's security, but for Caesar, they were also a weapon wielded by his enemies, a chance for them to paint him as reckless, overambitious, or even treasonous. Meanwhile, the unrest in Gaul deepened. Tribes once loyal to Rome began to waver, questioning whether the Republic could protect them. Merchant caravans stopped venturing north. Roman villas in frontier regions were abandoned. Farmers fled their land, and entire swaths of territory slipped into lawlessness. The Alps, once thought of as a natural shield, now seemed a brittle barrier. Rome's legions were stretched thin. Decades of political maneuvering had seen military power fragmented among rival generals, each hoarding forces for personal gain rather than the Republic's defense. Caesar's army in Gaul was formidable, but it was far from invincible. He had fewer men than he needed, and his supply lines stretched precariously across hostile lands. Every mile of road, every bridge, every river crossing was a potential point of disaster. In the Senate chambers, Caesar's opponents exploited these difficulties. Cicero and other eloquent statesmen spoke of the dangers of concentrating power in one man's hands, warning of Rome's descent into monarchy. They painted Caesar as a modern Sulla, a man whose ambition would drown the Republic in civil war. Their speeches fanned fear among the wealthy elite, who began quietly preparing for political upheaval, even as barbarian hordes raged across the north. This paralysis of leadership was Rome's greatest weakness. While senators schemed and argued, Caesar acted. But every decisive move he made on the battlefield sent shockwaves back to Rome, fueling rumors that he was building a personal empire in Gaul. He became both the Republic's sword and its greatest threat, a paradox that made every victory a double-edged blade. For the common people of Rome, these political games mattered little. Bread was scarce, riots flared in the Subura, where the city's poor lived crammed together in wooden tenements. The news from Gaul was terrifying, but Caesar's name began to carry hope among the masses. Here was a man who did not hide behind Senate walls, who did not send envoys or empty promises. He marched to the front, faced the enemy, and defended Rome's honor. The people began to chant his name in the streets, a sign that alarmed his rivals even more. As the Helvetii pushed deeper into Gaul, tension in the capital reached a breaking point. Rome's senators, draped in white togas, debated endlessly while the frontier burned red. Each speech was a dagger, each alliance a fragile truce. The republic that had once humbled kings and empires was now paralyzed by fear of its own champions. The Helvetii may have been barbarians in Roman eyes, but in truth, the greatest threat to Rome came from within, an empire so divided that even victory might bring ruin. For Caesar, this was both a curse and an opportunity. The Senate's hesitation gave him freedom to act, but it also left him vulnerable. He knew that every battle won would draw more suspicion, every triumph would bring him closer to being branded a tyrant. And yet Caesar was not a man to shrink from destiny. He understood that to save Rome, he would have to risk becoming its enemy. In the marble halls of the Senate, men whispered of treachery and ambition. In the streets, the poor whispered of hope, and on the wind that carried the scent of smoke from Gaul's burning forests, there was a question that no senator dared ask aloud. Could this man, this governor of a distant province, be the savior or the undoing of the Republic? To the Romans, the Helvetii were barbarians, an uncivilized people from the misty highlands of modern-day Switzerland. Yet to those who stood before their advancing columns, they were something far more formidable, a nation on the march, bound by desperation and destiny. They were not a scattered tribe or a loose confederation of raiders, but an entire civilization uprooted, moving like a storm across Gaul with the precision of an army and the relentlessness of a flood. Their exodus was born from necessity. For generations, the Helvetii had been hemmed in by mountains and rival tribes, trapped in a land too small to sustain their growing numbers. Facing starvation, political pressure, and threats from neighboring Germanic tribes, they chose a path that few dared to imagine. They burned their own homes and farmlands, destroying any hope of retreat, and set forth in search of a new homeland. What Rome saw as invasion, the Helvetii saw as survival. That desperation forged them into something terrifying, an unstoppable wave of people who had nothing left to lose. The Helvetii army was no ragtag band. Led by skilled chieftains such as Divico, a warrior of legendary reputation who had once humiliated a Roman army decades earlier, they were hardened fighters, raised in a land of harsh winters and steep mountainsides. Their warriors carried long spears, heavy shields, and swords forged for close combat. Their bodies were marked by scars and adorned with tribal tattoos, their presence on the battlefield enough to shake even seasoned soldiers. But what truly set them apart was their organization. The Helvetii migration was a feat of logistical mastery. Nearly 360,000 people, including 90,000 warriors, moved in coordinated columns, with wagons carrying supplies, families, and livestock. Their leaders established daily routes, ensuring that their army could advance swiftly while maintaining order. Scouts rode ahead to secure paths while warriors guarded the flanks, ready to strike at any Roman patrol foolish enough to approach. They were not raiders plundering out of greed. They were a nation armed to the teeth, carving a path toward survival. As they descended from their mountain strongholds, their presence struck terror into Gaul. Entire villages emptied at the sound of their war horns. Their columns stretched for miles, a seemingly endless procession of wagons, warriors, and banners adorned with fierce tribal symbols. The forests echoed with their chants, and their campfires lit the night sky like constellations scattered across the hills. To the Gauls, they were a moving city. To the Romans, they were a threat that could topple the Republic's northern frontier in a single campaign. The terrain itself seemed to favor them. The Helvetii knew the mountains intimately, navigating treacherous passes with ease, while Roman scouts struggled to keep pace. They used the rivers and forests of Gaul as both shield and sword, disappearing into dense woodland when pursued, then emerging unexpectedly to strike. Roman legions, accustomed to fighting in open fields where their formations could dominate, found themselves at a disadvantage in this rugged, unpredictable terrain. Divico, their most famous leader, embodied the Helvetii spirit of defiance. Years earlier, he had commanded at the Battle of Agen, where a Roman army under consul Lucius Cassius Longinus was annihilated, its standards captured, and its survivors sent home in shame. That humiliation remained etched in Roman memory, a reminder that these so-called barbarians could defeat even Rome's best. Now, as the Helvetii advanced again, Divico's presence was a chilling omen. This was not a people who feared Rome. This was a people who had bested her before. Caesar understood this better than anyone. Intelligence from his scouts painted a grim picture of Helvetii discipline. Unlike other migrating tribes, the Helvetii maintained strict order. Their warriors guarded the wagons day and night, their foraging parties moved in disciplined groups, and their leaders met in councils to plan every move. Even their women and children were trained for hardship, capable of enduring long marches without complaint. Caesar was not facing a disorganized mob. He was facing a mobile war machine. Every confrontation with the Helvetii was costly. Roman patrols sent to shadow their movements often vanished, their bodies later found mutilated as a warning. Villages that resisted were wiped out entirely, their inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. Yet even in their brutality, there was a grim efficiency. The Helvetii were not wanton killers. They struck quickly, decisively, and then moved on, leaving only ashes behind. Their campaign of terror was deliberate, meant to clear their path and demoralize their enemies before battle was even joined. Perhaps their greatest weapon, however, was their sheer scale. No Roman general had faced a migration of this size in living memory. The Helvetii did not march as an army of soldiers alone, but as an entire society in motion. For every warrior, there were families, elders, and children, an entire people united by necessity. To destroy them was not simply to win a battle. It would mean annihilating a nation. That moral weight hung over Caesar's campaign, but it did not weaken his resolve. To the Romans, mercy was a luxury they could not afford. As the Helvetii pressed deeper into Gaul, they drew weaker tribes into their orbit, some willingly joining their cause, others bowing out of fear. Their march threatened to unravel Rome's fragile network of alliances, destabilizing the entire region. Every day they advanced, the Republic's prestige diminished, and Caesar's challenge grew. By the time they approached the Rhone River, the Helvetii had become a legend. Roman spies reported stories of their ferocity, of warriors who fought to the death rather than surrender, of mothers who killed their children rather than see them enslaved, of chieftains who swore oaths to burn their wagons rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Their determination was absolute. This was not merely a clash of armies, it was a clash of civilizations. The Helvetii represented a raw, unyielding spirit, forged in hardship and sharpened by necessity. They had burned their homes to ash, severing any chance of retreat. To stop them, Caesar would have to destroy not just their warriors, but the very will of their people. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous challenge of all: how to break an enemy who had already burned his own world to the ground. As the Helvetii marched like a living tide, Caesar's mind became a forge of relentless calculation. The young governor knew that Rome's very prestige and his own destiny hung in the balance. The Helvetii were not simply an enemy to be repelled, they were a challenge to Roman supremacy itself, a gauntlet thrown down by a people unafraid of Rome's legions. To defeat them, Caesar would need more than courage. He would need genius. Where other generals might have chosen to retreat, to consolidate their forces and wait for reinforcements, Caesar advanced. He rode along the Rhone, his eyes scanning every bend of the river, every hill and forest clearing, until his mind painted a battlefield not yet fought, but already won. War to Caesar was a contest of intellect as much as steel. He did not merely fight battles, he designed them. His first move stunned even his own officers. He ordered the construction of a colossal defensive wall and trench system to block the Helveti's advance. Stretching for nearly 20 miles, this fortification was a testament to Roman engineering and discipline. His legions worked with feverish intensity, digging ditches 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, raising ramparts crowned with sharpened stakes. Caesar himself moved among the laborers, sleeves rolled up, inspiring his soldiers with his presence. For 6 days they worked without pause, transforming the Rhone's banks into an impregnable barrier. The Helvetii, arriving to find their path blocked by this wall of earth and timber, were stunned. They had expected the Romans to fight in open battle, not to imprison them with walls like a trapped beast. The fortification forced them to reconsider their strategy, buying Caesar precious time. This was Caesar's brilliance. He understood that war was not always won with swords, but with time and terrain. By forcing the Helvetii to take a longer, more arduous route, he disrupted their momentum and stretched their supply lines thin. It was a psychological victory as much as a tactical one, a demonstration that Rome's discipline could match their ferocity. Yet Caesar knew this was only the beginning. His scouts shadowed the Helveti's every move, reporting their numbers, their camp positions, and their daily routes. He began to strike with precision, launching small skirmishes to bleed them without risking full-scale engagement. His cavalry harassed their foraging parties, cutting off supplies, while his engineers built fortified camps each night, turning every Roman bivouac into a fortress. But Caesar's true genius lay in his ability to shape perception. He understood that morale was a weapon. Among his men, he cultivated confidence, speaking not of survival, but of destiny. Around the campfires, he reminded them of Rome's legacy, of how their forefathers had crushed Carthage, Macedon, and countless barbarian tribes. "We are not merely defending Rome," he told them. "We are writing her future. Every ditch you dig, every spear you sharpen, will echo through history." Among the Gallic tribes, he played a subtler game. Caesar sent envoys and gifts, forging alliances where possible, intimidating potential foes, and spreading stories of Roman strength. Some tribes, fearing Helvetii domination more than Roman rule, offered intelligence and supplies. Others were cowed into neutrality. Bit by bit, Caesar wove a net of influence that tightened around the Helvetii like a noose. As spring ripened into summer, the tension between the two forces reached its peak. The Helvetii, burdened by their slow-moving columns of families and wagons, found themselves running low on provisions. Caesar seized this moment to choose his battlefield. Near the hill town of Bibrat, he laid his trap. The terrain was perfect for Roman tactics: rolling hills that offered high ground for his legions, open fields that allowed disciplined formations to dominate, and narrow routes that forced the Helvetii into disadvantageous positions. Caesar placed his legions in a defensive posture, using his fortifications and cavalry to bait the Helvetii into an assault. When the Helvetii advanced, their columns stretched thin and weary, Caesar unleashed the precision of Roman warfare. Trumpets blared as legionaries locked shields and formed their famous testudo formations, advancing like iron walls. Ballistae hurled bolts into enemy ranks, while pila, Roman throwing spears, darkened the sky. The Helvetii, fierce as wolves, crashed against this wall of steel, but Caesar's discipline held. Then came Caesar's masterstroke, a flanking maneuver executed with deadly timing. As the Helvetii became entangled with the Roman center, Caesar sent his cavalry and reserves sweeping around their flanks. What had seemed a straightforward clash transformed into a nightmare for the Helvetii. Trapped between hills and Roman steel, their warriors fought with desperate ferocity, but exhaustion and chaos began to erode their lines. For hours the battle raged, the fields around Bibracte soaked in blood. Caesar rode along the front lines, rallying his soldiers, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos around him. Even as arrows and spears rained down, he was everywhere, at the center, on the flanks, shouting orders and encouragement. His soldiers fought not just for survival, but for a commander they believed was chosen by the gods. By nightfall, the Helvetii were in full retreat. Their migration, once a symbol of unstoppable force, was now a shattered column of survivors fleeing into the hills. Caesar did not relent. He pursued them relentlessly, forcing their surrender days later. Over 100,000 Helvetii were captured or killed, their wagons burned, their dreams of a new homeland crushed beneath Roman discipline. Yet Caesar's victory was more than military. It was psychological, political, and symbolic. In a single campaign, he had not only saved Gaul, but sent a thunderous message to Rome and the world. The Republic's northern frontier was secure, and Caesar was a force to be reckoned with. His enemies in the Senate could no longer dismiss him as an opportunist. His name now carried the weight of conquest. The Helvetii, once a terrifying legend, had been humbled. Their survivors resettled under Roman terms. Gaul, for the moment, was pacified. But Caesar's eyes already looked beyond this victory. He had tasted power and glory on a scale few men had ever known, and he was not about to stop. The conquest of Gaul was only beginning, and the man who had risen from political scandal was now a master of war, a commander whose ambition would reshape the very world. The dust of Bibracte had barely settled when Caesar's legions stood victorious, their shields dented, their tunics soaked with the sweat and blood of battle. The once mighty Helvetii, who had swept across Gaul like an unstoppable storm, were now broken. Tens of thousands slain, their survivors huddled in despair, their wagons smoldering ruins along the roadside. Yet this was not merely a victory of arms. It was a rebirth of Roman authority, forged in steel and sealed in blood. For generations, Rome's northern provinces had been plagued by fear. Whispers of barbarian hordes haunted the Senate's halls. Governors had been content to pay bribes, build flimsy defenses, or simply look the other way as entire tribes moved unchecked. But now that image of a complacent Rome was shattered. In a single campaign, Caesar had rewritten the rules. He summoned the surviving Helvetii chieftains, who approached his command tent with solemn faces, their pride smothered beneath exhaustion and fear. Caesar listened as they begged for mercy. In his commanding yet measured tone, he imposed his verdict. The Helvetii would return to their homeland and rebuild their ravaged villages, this time as subjects bound by Roman order. Their migration, which had begun as an act of defiance, ended in submission. This act was more than magnanimity, it was strategy. By repopulating Helvetian lands, Caesar created a buffer zone that would shield Rome's frontier from future invasions. It was a masterstroke of political engineering, as impressive as his battlefield tactics. Rome did not merely conquer, Rome reshaped the map. News of Caesar's triumph swept across the Republic like wildfire. In Rome, senators who once dismissed him as an ambitious opportunist now whispered his name with a mixture of fear and awe. The citizens, hungry for stories of heroism and glory, hailed him as a savior of the Republic. Scrolls bearing news of his victory circulated through marketplaces, and poets began composing verses celebrating the general who had tamed Gaul's fiercest tribe. But for Caesar, this victory was not an end. It was a beginning. He knew that Gaul was a land divided, a mosaic of tribes bound by fragile alliances and ancient rivalries. The Helveti's defeat had sent shockwaves through the region, but it had also stirred resentment. Other tribes, alarmed by Rome's sudden assertiveness, began to form secret pacts, preparing to challenge the rising star from Rome. Standing on the blood-stained fields of Bibracte, Caesar gazed across the rolling hills of Gaul, his mind already racing ahead. The conquest of an entire landmass was not achieved in a single battle. It required a campaign of relentless pressure, diplomacy, and fear. He would strike swiftly, exploiting tribal divisions, forging alliances, and crushing resistance with calculated brutality. Yet Caesar's brilliance lay not only in military genius, but in his ability to weave narrative. He knew that perception was power. His official reports to the Senate, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, were crafted not merely as records of battle, but as political propaganda. He depicted himself as a protector of Rome's borders, a champion of civilization against barbarism. Every skirmish, every campaign was framed as part of a divine destiny, a mission to extend Rome's light into lands of darkness. His soldiers, too, were transformed by this victory. No longer were they a hastily assembled force defending a frontier. They were veterans, hardened by triumph, bound by loyalty to their commander. Caesar ensured their devotion not only through victory, but through generosity, sharing spoils, rewarding valor, and marching alongside them as an equal in hardship. They loved him not merely as a general, but as a leader who embodied Rome's ideals. The Helvetei's shattered columns served as a warning to Gaul. Resistance would be met with annihilation. But among the tribes, whispers began to spread of a man whose ambition had no limits. Chieftains who had once dismissed Rome as a distant threat now feared that their lands would be next. In taverns, fireside gatherings, and tribal councils, a new narrative began to form. A coalition of tribes might be the only hope to resist this Roman juggernaut. This tension, this rising storm, was precisely what Caesar wanted. Chaos was a weapon he could wield. By striking first and striking hard, he would ensure that Gaul never united against him. As his legions marched through the conquered lands, they left more than devastation. They built roads, fortified camps, and established supply chains that would sustain a long campaign. Rome's power was not fleeting, it was infrastructural, turning hostile terrain into a Roman machine of war. Each mile of road laid down was as much a conquest as a battle won. And yet, beneath the political theater and military engineering, Caesar himself was changing. Once a politician scrambling for relevance, he now walked in the shadow of Alexander and Hannibal, his name spoken with reverence by soldiers and terror by enemies. He felt destiny pressing upon him, whispering that this was only the first act of a saga that would shake the ancient world. The climax of Bibracte was not simply a Roman victory. It was the opening trumpet of a symphony of war that would echo across Europe. In the coming years, Caesar would annihilate entire tribes, subjugate Gaul, and even cross the waters into Britain, pushing the boundaries of the known world. But in this moment, standing among his weary yet triumphant soldiers, his crimson cloak billowing in the mountain wind, he had already altered history's course. Rome, once seen as a crumbling republic, was reborn in the fires of this campaign. And Caesar, a man whom many had underestimated, had carved a path to power not through intrigue or speeches, but through blood-soaked fields and the unshakable loyalty of his legions. As night fell over Gaul, campfires flickered like stars across the hills, casting long shadows over the slain. The Helveti's songs of migration, once filled with hope for a better land, were silenced forever. In their place rose the Roman eagle, glinting in the firelight, a symbol of dominance and destiny. And so began a new chapter in the saga of Rome, a chapter written in iron and ambition, where the rise of one man would change the fate of empires. The world would never be the same again.